Sorry for that short delay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having a great panel here. We hope to talk about translations in South Asia. We want to talk about how translations stand today in South Asia and our respective publishing industries, and how we can use translations to take our writing to the rest of the world. In Nepal, most of us know in recent times we've got Manjushri Thapa and Praveen Adhikari who've translated Indra Bahadur Rai. Manjushri has, of course, translated a lot of Nepali writing into English. We've had from other languages into Nepali. Recently, we've had Yug Pathak's Ghachar Ghochar. We've had Khagendai's history of translating leftist literature. But of course, more needs to be done. We have to take Nepali writing abroad. How do we do that? What sort of lessons can we learn from? We have a prolific list of translators and editors here. So we've done the introductions. I'll go immediately to Arunava. He has 51 translations published so far. The first translation was published in 2000. So that comes to about nearly 3 books a year. So I'll just ask him, when you started pitching translations to publishers in India, how did they react to it? And what is the sort of change that you've seen in, let's say, these 20 years to, let's say, the approach towards translations? Do publishers now actively seek out more translations? And what is the whole scene like now?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in Pokhara and Nepal. So yes, to answer your question, the first wave of translation publishing in English from the other Indian languages, and you know in India we have at least a dozen languages with very robust literatures in each of them. That process actually first began in the 1970s when there were a small group of local English language publishers, but then it kind of died down in the 80s and mostly in the 90s still. Mid-90s onwards, when Penguin set up shop in India, that's when a lot of the editors soon afterwards started getting interested in bringing this wealth of non-English language literatures of India into the English language. And coincidentally or otherwise, it happened that most of the editors in English language in publishing in India were from Bengal and Calcutta to begin with. So as a result, their attention was initially on Bengali literature, which of course is a huge body of work, and not just from the Bengali-speaking part of India, but also from Rifat's Bangladesh. So at that point, there was a great deal of interest because suddenly you had this huge treasure trove of books which had already proved themselves in their own languages and had built up huge reputations, and suddenly the opportunity to publish them in English. If anything, there was a dearth of enough translators. Then after the first wave, mostly of Bangla, as I said, other language translators in other languages also started translating and getting published. So for about 10 years from the late 90s till the late 2000s, it was really a golden time for publishing translations in English. Then there was a little bit of a drop, and that perhaps had less to do with translations and more to do with the fact that people were losing interest in terms of buying books when it came to serious fiction. A whole wave of popular fiction came up in India in English. Audiences were becoming younger. There was a big demographic change. And most important, television and then subsequently the internet was taking over the space of even serious entertainment. So translations have also been a victim of this, with the result that far fewer translations are published now. But on the flip side, only really good translations are published. It's hard now to find a big publisher publishing a poor translation.
That's quite interesting. So, of course, I mean, India is a massive publishing industry, especially in South Asia. It dominates South Asia in many ways, not just in publishing. I want to move to you, Carmen. Carmen's Sinhalese Sri Lankan academic who's also translated from Sinhalese into English, an award-winning translation. I want to ask you, could you introduce our audience to Sri Lankan writing, the Sri Lankan publishing industry, and the sort of challenges, let's say, it faces from such a big Indian industry?
When it comes to translation, I'm not very sure if India as a giant in publishing poses such a big challenge. But what I should like to say is maybe perhaps the Cold War helped when it came to translation in Sri Lanka, especially during the 50s, 60s and 70s, when the Soviets set up what was called the progressive publishers in Sri Lanka, and there were a lot of Russian novels, in particular being translated into Sinhala. But of course, the end of the Cold War kind of did not help translation in Sri Lanka. Translation kind of died down to some extent. But I think one of the things that's happening is there's a lot of interest in English books being translated into Sinhala and Tamil. But what is important is what is being translated. I think there is a lot of interest in children's books, particularly Enid Blyton, I'm sure everyone has heard of, the Hardy Boys, the Nancy Drew, that kind of stuff. But other than that, I don't think there's a lot of serious translation. And then, of course, there are politically, I would call, ideologically suspect works. Like this Jean Sassoon's works about the Middle Eastern women and their supposed oppression, you know, that kind of work being translated into Sinhala, which then feeds a certain kind of anti-Middle Eastern sentiments in Sri Lanka. So I think what is important is the directionality when it comes to translation. There's interest in translating from English into Sinhala and Tamil, of course certain kinds of works, but there isn't as much interest in translating from Sinhala and Tamil, the two national languages in Sri Lanka, into English, particularly good creative writing. And I think it's even more important to mention that there is hardly any translation between the two local languages or the two national languages, Sinhala and Tamil. And I'm sure those in the audience must be even a little bit aware of the civil war, which of course concluded in 2009, but the tensions, the misunderstandings between the two main ethnic groups still remain. So I think it is kind of one of the sad situations that there is little being translated between Sinhala and Tamil, because as we all know, literature or creative writing can help promote understanding between communities. So we who live so close to each other in Sri Lanka, I think know very little about each other because so little of that literature is being translated.
One interesting point you raised about the Soviets funding a lot of translations of leftist writing. Nepal also has had a flourishing, let's say, translating industry of communist literature. I think Mother by Gorky would be the highest selling book in Nepali, like even now, after so many years. Rifat, I want to come to you. And so what is the Bangladeshi publishing industry like in terms of translation? I mean, does it face similar issues? Is there a sort of a majoritarian, like I assume that Bengali is the majority language, but are there other translations happening from other languages? What is it like?
Thank you. Thank you, Amish. I'd also like to thank the organizers for having me here. And this place is beautiful. This place, I mean, looking around, it seems like this is the perfect place for this kind of festival, literary festival, where literary minds get together. So now, I'd like to answer your question. So the Bangladeshi situation is not very different from the picture that Arunava Sinha has just painted about the Indian scene. But since Carmen touched upon the progressive publishers, I should also touch upon that, because one of the first translation initiatives actually came from that. I mean, when this Pragati publishers, I mean, progressive publishers in English it was called, and in Bangla it was called Pragati publishers, totally funded by Russia, started. And then there was a huge translation initiative which actually translated not only Maxim Gorky or Turgenev. It translated so many books that had something to do with, Marxist theories, Marxist revolution, etc., etc. But one of the good things about this is this initiative translated a lot of books, and the translations were always good. So then there is translation from Bangla to English. No, Bangla is the majority language there, and from other indigenous languages, some translations are happening now from Chakma and from Marma into English, but that is too low, done on a low key, very low key, and the scene of translation from Bangla to English is not satisfactory at all. But yeah, some good works are happening now, and people like Arunava, Sinha contributing, and Bangladeshi translators, and also some non-Bangla speaking translators are also coming forward. So altogether, it is only recently that we see the kind of activities that should be there into translating Bangla literature, or for that matter, any local literature in South Asia into English. So, but yeah, a lot more needs to be done. That's it.
Carmen, you raised an interesting point about the interactions not happening, right? I think it's also languages in our part of the world, there's a sort of a dual edge. First, there is the challenge of English itself, and then there is the challenge of, let's say, the majority language. For example, in Nepal, Nepali is the majority language, but we have over 100 languages in the country. So, of course, there is writing in these other languages that gets overshadowed by the dominant language. I want to get a sense of, from Sri Lanka, we've got a lot of writers from English now who are popular across the world. Shehan's there, Naomi is there. What is the sort of view that writing, like Sri Lankan writing in English, how is it seen? And does it sort of provide an impetus to local writing, local writers? What does it do?
Yes, so I think when it comes to, you talked about dominant languages and so on, I think in a way, of course, Sinhala, which is spoken by 75% of the population, for those of you here, I do not wish to insult you, but in Sri Lanka we have two major local languages, Sinhala and Tamil, and then there's English. Now, numerically speaking, of course, 75% or so of the population speak Sinhala, and then 25% Tamil speaking. The English-speaking population, fluent, particularly those who read literature in English, would be very small. That's maybe less than 5%. But of course, when it comes to dominance, domination, power, I think that could be different, because English may be spoken only by a small minority, but it carries a lot of power because it's a prestige language. It's a language associated with status and power and privileges and so on. So when it comes to writing, those who write in English, yes, several of them are very well known. Some of them, of course, diasporic writers like Shyam Selvadore and so on. Some of their writing has been translated into Sinhala and some into Tamil. But I think by and large, I think English writers, Sri Lankan English writers, and those writing in Sinhala and Tamil, they tend to traverse what I would like to call parallel universes. There is very little interaction between these different language communities. So while some of it is translated, I think they remain to a large extent, the writers in the three languages, they remain to a large extent unaware of each other. And of course, for Sinhala in particular, of course, it's the majority community's language. There is a big market for Sinhala writing. But as I said earlier about the direction when it comes to translation, a few of these Sinhala writing is being translated into English. And as I said, there's more interest in English writing, and that is being translated into Sinhala. So I think it is an unfortunate situation that the larger majority of Sinhala and Tamil speaking people in Sri Lanka, I think remain unaware of these internationally acclaimed, award-winning Sri Lankan writers in English. Yes.
I want to come back to both Arunava and Rifat. Again, the similar question, India, Bangladesh, again, I suppose like English is the language of the dominant class. It's the influential language, right? How does local language or local writing react to this? And of course, within India itself, Bengali is a lot of, like there is an overwhelming sort of majority of Bengali translations, right? And a lot of other languages you don't see that much. So what is the sort of sense you get when you meet, let's say, publishers, when you, let's say, meet, when you speak to students? Is there a sort of sense that, all right, besides English, these local languages also should be talked about, should be translated, should be written about? What is the sense?
So can you please rephrase the question for me in, again, just the last part?
So when you meet others, right? When you meet let's say the publishers, when you meet editors, when you meet translators, is there a sense that, okay, because English is the dominant language, it's the influential language, it will remain so, and therefore the other languages will get overshadowed because of that? Or do you think there is a sense that, all right, alongside English, these languages should also get attention?
No, the response actually when in English writing, when it comes to English writing, the response is nothing like that. The response is almost always, how should I put it, negative, very negative, because it's a very small market in Bangladesh for English writing and for English readers. There was this novel which kind of did very well, named Babu Bangladesh, and the writer died unfortunately right after finishing his novel. So there was this session about this novel, Babu Bangladesh, in the last Dhaka Lit Fest. So one of the English writers in Bangladesh, he was talking about, while discussing the novel, he was talking about how actually the status of English writing in Bangladesh. So he was very funnily, jokingly saying that in English, if you write in English in Bangladesh, you can write anything because you write it in English and nobody reads it. So you see, so the thing is, what Bangladeshi writers are trying to do, and I think over the years they're doing well, they're doing better than before. They are trying to make a place in the larger South Asian market, trying to work more with the multinational companies who have, as Arunava pointed out, set up their shops in India or in some other South Asian region. So they're increasingly working with them, and some diaspora writers like Tahmima Anam or say Monica Ali, they're also they're working with UK, US publishers. So that's the future of actually English writing. Publishers do not show any interest in publishing English writing because it doesn't really sell. It might sell outside Bangladesh. And the kind of parallel universe that Carmen referred, that also actually exists. And some of us literary journalists, writers, we are trying, we at least we have started trying to address this gap, but this gap is also there in Dhaka, Bangladesh. The majority language, Bengali readers, they are not so well connected to the scene in English writing. So that's it.
Arunava, you want to add something?
Yeah, so in India, it's not quite the same picture. But English writing in India, in fiction particularly, is really about 50 years old on an industrial scale. So we must remember that the literatures of India grew up in the non-English languages. Right from the turn of the 19th century, the writing has been in local languages. The writing, the publishing, the reading, everything. Then there was a little bit of English writing here and there, but infamously, now infamously in 1981, Salman Rushdie produced an anthology of Indian writing, which was, with one exception, all of it was originally written in English. And this became Indian literature's face to the world. And he also equally infamously wrote there that all the great writing in India is now only in English. It is sad that the non-English writers did not actually howl in protest. They should have at that point. But there was they didn't care because their books were still selling. But the funny thing in India is that, like Sinhala and Tamil, each language had its own island and nobody looked beyond it. So while up until the 1950s or 60s, there was a very robust tradition of translation between languages, so much so that many, for example, many writers in the south of India thought that some Bengali writers were actually locals. They had no idea that they were translated writers. So one of the better known ones, for example, Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay, was actually considered to be a Tamil writer by Tamil readers and a Malayali writer by Malayalam readers, and they even named their children after them, revered figures. So that was wonderful, really. But all that died down because people who were truly bilingual, their numbers dwindled. As education became very job-oriented, English took over. And that led to a wave of English fiction writing. Then when the English language publishers came in, they were the first ones with a pan-Indian market, unlike the regional language publishers. So the only books naturally that would find readers all over India had to be in English. And so they began publishing Indian writers who then took up space in the popular media and they became celebrities. And then Salman Rushdie won the Booker Prize, and then Arundhati Roy won the Booker Prize, and then some other writers whom I will not mention undeservedly won the Booker Prize. So, from India that is. So, it became a bit of a thing. And and then what happened among the younger crop of, say, writers from Tamil or Malayalam or Bengali or Hindi is that they started saying, are our books not good enough? Why can't we find world markets? So the pushback began. And now, of course, there's a lot of, I'm sorry to say, but the literary world is as full of petty politics as any other world with low stakes and high ambitions. Because the stakes are really low, we once checked that no matter which country in the world you're in, apparently any book other than a breakout book will never sell more than 3,000 copies. Whether it's Italy, whether it's the UK, whether it's India, whether it's the US. Breakout books, of course, are a different story altogether. So the stakes are low. Personal celebrity is very important. Writers have become more concerned about how much they're recognized and less about how much their books sell, because their books don't sell. So Litfest invitations are very important. And the whole marketing has moved from the books to the authors. It's the authors who are the figures now. And people also come and throng around the authors and they take their signatures, but they don't read their books. So in this context, English language publishers are actually finding it hard to publish a lot of fiction. So they're turning more and more to non-fiction, which is of far greater interest because it talks to your times. It talks to things people are currently interested in, politics, history, science, and of Bollywood. Bollywood not so much because those who watch cannot read. So Bollywood books, oddly enough, don't sell very much. People have a lot of ambitions. Biographies of stars will sell. But the more popular the star, the fewer the books sell. Because obviously they're not going to read, right? They can just go and watch. Yeah. So, but now what's happening is that a lot of writers are now writing with a view on national and international markets, with their eye on it. So that's not necessarily a good thing because they're starting to think of their readers rather than writing about what they really are good with. So, the regional literatures are acquiring a kind of strange, anodyne, global flavor in a bid to appeal to global audiences and to hit the global translation market, because the money you can make even if you are published by an indie publisher in the UK is 10 times what you will make by having your translated book published and sold in India. So all language, and the other good piece of news is that Bengali is no longer the dominant literature outside of English. Malayalam is very big now. Tamil is big. And they're spearheaded by certain writers. Like Perumal Murugan from Tamil is a big name. One person is spearheading Kannada literature. That's Vivek Shanbag, whose books are now being published in all kinds of European countries. So the whole thing is, I think it's going through a phase of churn of some kind, and something more stable will emerge at the end of it. But the good news, I would say, overall, is that English language writing is no longer the dominant force. And translation, although the books are having to be translated into English in order to be read, the fact is that these are the books that people are much more interested in now. And if you look at shortlists like the DSC Prize, of which Rifat and Carmen are both jury members, if you look at the books from India and this whole South Asian area, you'll find that these are not the kind of, magical realism, vague notion of mystical notion of South Asia. Those are not the big books anymore. The big books are ground up. They're talking grittily. They're not MFA fine writing. They're actually very hard, felt lived lives. If you look at the other prizes in India, which have been looking at Indian books, amazingly, they're books that are that are set in the fields of Tamil Nadu, in the jails of Bengal, in a woman from Bangalore traveling to Kashmir, which is also on the short list here. So these are books from outside of that mainstream of English writing. Wonderful as that was, I think that has had its day now. And a whole new literature, even in English, is taking over, and translated books are becoming part of the English canon, as it were, even if it's current canon. So the whole notion of what English language literature in India is changing dramatically because of translations.
Thank you, Arunava. Before I open the floor to questions, one last question to all three of you. So in Nepal, we are trying to sort of take our literature abroad through translations, or perhaps encourage more translations here. From each of you, just a short point on what we should do to take Nepali literature abroad. Should we go for the canon, or should we go for more contemporary writing? And what are your thoughts on how we can perhaps make Nepali literature more visible outside? I'll start with Carmen.
In response to your question, Amish, I'm not really sure what you meant by the canon, because the canon can also change from one country to another, what is considered the canon. But if you mean by that something classical, something, written...
Yeah, the great classics of, let's say, Nepali writing, so as to say.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends, because I think the problem with translating the canon and publishing is that then it is appealing to a certain kind of readership. So I would say that perhaps maybe a mix would be better, because there would be a certain kind of reader who would be interested in reading translations from the canon. Perhaps, again, it depends on what kind of translation, because when you're translating canonical literature, you can write to somebody who is actually, you can do an academic translation versus a more popular, readable translation for the ordinary or everyday reader or general reader. So I would say that it should be a mix, because I think what is important, I think even as a South Asian from Sri Lanka, I think we hardly find Nepali writing, translated into English, because unless it's translated into English, I won't be able to read it. So I think maybe a mix of contemporary stuff, just to, to popularize just Nepal writing, Nepali people. I think that would be my suggestion, a mix.
It's a very important question. So I'd like to begin with my experience in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, what in the 1990s, in the beginning of this century also, what translators used to do, some of them still do that, is that they translated books of Bangla literature, Bangla writing, and then got one or the other publisher to publish those books, most of the time bearing the cost of their own books. You know what that means. I mean, they do not get paid by the publisher, rather they pay the publisher to publish their own works. So what they do then, or what happens actually, is that the book, a Bangla fiction, is translated into English and it is remaining inside the country. So it makes no sense, because no one is going to read that work of fiction in English. I mean, there might be some people like 100, the people who live in the diplomatic zones who cannot read Bangla. So I think the same thing applies to all the countries except India, because in India it's a different picture, you know. In India, if you translate a book into English and if you keep that book inside India, it sells a lot more than what, you know, translations in all the other countries put together will sell. So that's my answer, and that is something what I think is very important, and I think all the South Asian countries should do this. Focus on how translation, English translation or other language translations, how they can send those translations outside of their own country. So I think the way to do that is to build up a professional, you know, a relationship with South Asian publishers who operate on a bigger scale, on a larger scale. So that is something I think we fail to appreciate in other South Asian countries. I mean, in countries, South Asian countries other than India. So I'd like to comment. I mean, before I conclude, just one more thing, and that is, back in 2013, I used to head a books department of a English daily in Bangladesh. So my job was mainly to buy rights from them and do Bangladeshi editions, and also try to get them to buy rights for our quality translations. I mean, quality translations of English translations of Bangla literature. So their response, I mean, the response of the UK and US publishers were not very positive, because, you know, I think we all will agree that there is something different about South Asian writing, which just Arunava just implied in his response. So they don't like the amount of, what should I say? They don't like the amount of history that our writers, South Asian writers, deal with. It's not to say that their work is devoid of history, but their work is, I mean, more focused on abstraction and other notions or theories of literature. So what I'm trying to say is I'm not really optimistic about sending our works to the UK and US market. I mean, if any work succeeds, that is very well and good. But I'm more optimistic about South Asia being the market for our translations. I want Nepali, I want English translation of Nepali literature to have a market in Bangladesh, and I the same, you know, about Bangladeshi literature having a market in Nepal. So Indian translation of Indian works, they already have a market in Bangladesh, and I want the same. You know, I want also a Bangladeshi translation of our writing to have a market in India. So that's my take, and I think we all should try to do that.
So to add to what Carmen and Rifat said, I'll just list some sort of bullet points activities that I think need to be done. One, there are 2 or 3 very influential journals of translation which publishers around the world read to discover new literature they can publish. So Words Without Borders, Asymptote. First step is to get some translations of short stories or sections of novels published in these spaces. Next, look for maybe half a dozen possibilities of breakout books, the way, let's say, Midnight's Children took interest in Indian literature to the Western world. Look for books like that, which will suddenly make the world sit up and say, oh, wow, where's this from? So that's important. Now, whether that's in the canon or whether that's contemporary is not the point. The point is it must be something that will break into the current scenario. 3, there are a lot of independent publishers, indie publishers in the West who are actually looking for books outside of white male writers. And they, in fact, even get funds to publish this. So the UK Arts Council, although I don't know what will happen under the new government, but up until now, the UK Arts Council actually used to fund publishers for publishing books by non-white, non-UK, non-American writers. So there's a distinct market for that. So that's on the demand side. Now, how do you meet that on the supply side? One, produce a definitive anthology of Nepali fiction in translation. One definitive book which sort of covers the span so that people say, okay, let me go through this. And even if they like 4 stories or 5 stories, they get a sense of what is going on. 2, get this published not just in India, but also with publishers in the West. Now, sometimes this may need publishing grants. Countries like Korea, which have broken into the Western market, have done this by their governments, actually subsidizing the translation and publishing of books from their country. So, someone has to provide the money, whether it's the government, whether it's a philanthropist from the industrial sector who feels the need to make Nepal a soft cultural power abroad. And it's not a great deal of money, so it's possible. 3, very important, or 4, 5, whatever, very important, get a delegation of publishers from the West to visit Nepal and make them meet writers here. It's very important for them to actually meet writers in their own spaces to understand where their books come from. Otherwise, right now, it's filtered by too many layers and you don't get a raw sense of what the literature here is about, right? And 6, work on initiatives like making Nepal the theme country at various book fairs. So at Frankfurt, at London, and so on. So once a country becomes the theme country, then everyone's interested in knowing what's going on. You take your best writers there, make them meet audiences from the West. But in order to be able to succeed in all this, it is crucial to have a large number of extremely good translators. So you have to work on that as well. Maybe you need to set up a translation school. Maybe you need to fund people to go to translation school abroad, attend MFA programs. But do a 5-year program where you hold a contest, ask people to submit translations, pick the 6 best translators, send them up, fund them for Iowa. There's a translation workshop that they hold there. Fund them for an MFA program in translation. And they will come back and start translating these books. And, you can do it. It can be planned as a project, provided your literature is great, which, of course, it is. So it's just a matter of bridging the gap now.
Thank you. Thank you, Arunava. Thank you, Rifat. Thank you, Carmen. I think we have the time for about 2 questions, 2 or 3, 15 minutes. All right. So about 3 questions. I'll take questions in Nepali. Nepali ma questions are linju haina. Translate garera I can ask the panelists. Please keep your questions short. Please say who your question is addressed to and who you wanted to be answered by.
By the way, I just wanted to add that Amish is asking questions, but he has all the answers to himself. He's a true blue publishing professional and he knows the field very well indeed.
Arunava. He's just being kind over here. Yeah. Oh. Sorry, Mike. Sorry, त्यहाँ पछाडि छ है.
Hello? Okay. My question is primarily directed towards Arunava Sinha, but directed towards others too, other panelists too. I've seen, I've noticed that in the recent years, there has been a flood of mythological novels in Indian writing in English. Even in Nepali literature, there have been, I've seen a lot of mythological novels and mythological literary works, even some respectable works like Radha and Ashwatthama by respected writers, respectable writers. But I haven't seen, and some of them have even been translated into English. For example, Radha, Ashwatthama. I haven't seen a whole lot of, I haven't seen much of translations of mythological literature with alternative interpretations of characters and so on in other languages, in other South Asian languages, translated into English. Is that because there is not a whole lot of mythological literature in Hindi and other vernacular Indian languages, and in the Sinhalese literature, in Bengali literature, or if there is a lot of, if a lot of such literature in vernacular languages are being published, why is there no sufficient interest in translating such literature into English?
Why isn't there sufficient interest in translating mythology?
Yeah, so I won't claim to be an expert on how much of mythological literature is being written in the non-English languages in India, but my understanding is that what is being written now is of a political nature. It is not a blatant commercial attempt to cash in on the myths and legends for an audience that did not know these stories, which is very much the trend in English, which is to write very, very popular versions and very modern day characters masquerading as mythological figures. This is a flavor. It's here for a while. It's already on the decline. Frankly, in another few years, it will go away. What gets written in the regional languages is much more serious, and therefore it does not find market in English translation, because who wants to read alternatives on Sita and alternatives on Draupadi, right? Everyone wants the mainstream view. So alternatives get written, they get translated to a small extent, and then they are forgotten very quickly as well. No, not much commercial value over there.
Also, I want to add, in English writing in India, there's a lot of commercial writing that presents alternative views. There's also a lot of literary writing, like Volga. She's written on Yashodhara, she's written on Sita, so that's something you might want to look at. Volga, yeah. Itisha, I think, has a question here. Sorry.
Yeah, so my name is Surina Narula. We are one of the founders of the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. So what I thought was just a comment that what was missing was the 20 million diaspora, the people who live abroad like us. And our children and grandchildren are now getting very curious about their own countries, and they read English literature to figure out what's going on. And similarly, people living there are writing about how they are going through life in the South Asian, sort of living in England, in America. So people here are very curious to know what's going on. So there is a lot more demand for English literature. And my also third thing was, I was speaking to publishers last night here, and most of them were sort of not very sure whether they should be applying for this prize, DSC prize. They're not even aware, because in the sense that our books are not so great, one of them said. We are still working on it. I said, it doesn't matter, let the jury decide. At least submit 2 books each. Each publisher here should submit 2 books each, which are translated, and let the jury decide. So we are not getting enough books. That's my worry. We are not getting enough books from publishers. So that was just a comment. So.
That's a great comment, actually, and that's actually a call to all our publishers, not just in Nepal, I think it was Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, to submit to more prizes, to be more aware of what international publishing is all about and how it operates. You have the... Yeah.
Yes, hi. My question would be for Arunava. So when you were listing the bullet points, you said, you need to do this, right? My question would be, we don't really know who the you is, in the sense, how do you maintain plurality of voices, genres, styles, in a country like Nepal, where what is commissioned for translation, for example, might just be a reflection of the socio-historic realities in terms of power structures and hierarchies. So how do you go about maintaining or, creating a very diverse work of literatures for translation?
That's a great question. And while most countries have gone through that route of first starting out with, as you said, the gatekeepers protect the status quo, only then do wider voices come in, you could upend that because it hasn't begun yet. So I would say that in an internet-enabled age, the best way is for translators to start translating and publishing online. And if individual translators, if 100 translators, 1,000 translators start picking their own literatures without any gatekeepers, I would imagine that diversity would be reflected there. But absolutely right. As for who the you is, that's a very important question. And it's people like you actually who is. It's not the people in power. It's the people who love literature and who can come together and do this.
Hello everyone, I'm Sudarshan. My question, I have two questions. First one, any one of you can answer. As we are talking about translating and we are here in Nepal, are there any Nepalese books that you have read? Because translated books, and if you have read, are there some that you really like? And next question would be, like, as we are giving away DSC prize in this festival too, but all the books are actually in English. They are all either translated or originally written in English. So as the books of such writer as like Manoranjan Vyapari, who has also been nominated, reach to us in form of English language, is it worthwhile to just write in the original language or to just write directly on English language, because it reaches people faster? Because Manoranjan Vyapari book is firstly in Bangla, I guess, and then it is translated into English, whereas some other shortlisted writers' book are directly written into English. So that's also added effort to just reach to the same place where they are placed. So anyone of you can answer that.
The first one, any one of you? Have you guys read any Nepali books? Yeah. So Arunava has read Indra Bahadur Rai. So again, through translation, the recent translation, right? Yeah. Any?
No, I'm proud to say, I mean, I'm ashamed to say that I haven't. But I'm looking forward to.
Yeah.
I think I shook my head then. People were looking rather guilty. So I think that question is answered. But I think the question you asked about the prize, mentioning in particular the DSC, yes, it is given to writing in English, either originally in English or translated into English. But I don't think we always write for a prize or to be able to submit our work for a prize. So while this particular prize may be, at least right now, the founder or the founders are here, but there are other prizes, but I don't think we should write just for a prize. So what I actually find is that in at least the major languages of South Asia, there are thriving literatures, and there is a readership for that literature in that language. So I'm pretty sure that when Manoranjan Vyapari wrote in Bangla, he was not hoping somebody will translate into English and then the route will be created for the DSC. So in the same way, I think it is good to write in the local languages, and I think there are advantages to writing in a local language, because there is an established community that speaks the language. So you don't have to do the paraphrasing and kind of interlinear translation that you do when you write in English in South Asia. If you read South Asian writing in English, you will see that there's a lot of paraphrasing and interlinear translation, which is very interesting to study. So I would think that writing in any language, as long as there is a community, I think is what should be the aim. Because if you write sincerely of things you understand and you feel about, I'm sure your community of readers will also appreciate it.
Any other questions? Oh, there's one question there.
This is primarily to Arunava because it pertains to Indian translation. Because there are multiple levels of languages, and I presume now that translation is taking up quite a bit of space in the Indian literary market. There are lots of good translators like yourself, but there was a time when some of the great classics like Kuratula and Haidar's Akka Darya was written in Urdu, or let's say O.V. Vijayan's Khasak and Ityasam, which was written in Malayalam. Many of these people also had an English teaching background. So what happened is they tend to be overly possessive of their work, and they choose to translate themselves. And very often what we see is that we get a very, very arcane English, which is it's more British-oriented or rather bureaucratic English of an older generation. Do you reckon we now have a strong enough strength of translators which can get over this kind of a seemingly difficult bridge to cross once upon a time? Thank you.
Absolutely, we do, and in fact it is my belief that the classics should be translated over and over for every generation. And I think we should also smash through the resistance put up by the families of these writers who seem to possess them more than the original writers did and refuse to allow new translations. So yeah, we should just hijack it and just do it and put it up online. And
I'll just add to one last thing of that. He said that there's a body of translation, increasing number of translators now in India. You are teaching a course, I believe, in Ashoka. Could you tell us just a little bit about how that course came to be, and can it be replicated in other countries in South Asia?
Yeah, so the course came to be simply by virtue, frankly, I just went and said, I'm going to teach this course. So, but what it did was that for many young people who want to write, but who are hesitant because they're frightened whether their material is good enough, it's a great opportunity to use material that's already there, tried and tested, and put it in a different language. So it's like when you start painting, you start by copying the masters, right? So that was how the course originated. And the best thing it's done perhaps is that a whole bunch of people in their late teens and early 20s are now interested in reconnecting with literatures in their mother tongues. And they're going back and furiously reading, which is not something that they did earlier. So I think it's eminently, in fact, something like that in Nepal or elsewhere where there's not a high number of translators would be a great way to begin.
All right. With that, I think we are done with time. I'm sorry. Sorry, Rifat has just one sec.
I just want to qualify my answer to the previous question of this young man who wanted to know if we are familiar with Nepal's literature. Well, it just occurred to my mind that I'm familiar with Manjushree Thapa's work. I'm not sure if you were talking about translated literature or original English writing, but I'm familiar with Manjushree Thapa's writing, and then I am a religious follower of Himal South Asian magazine, and now with my friendship with Kunda Dixit, I'm also a fan of Nepali Times. So that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Please give a big hand to our panelists.